The blizzard outside was a starving beast, but the silence inside the fortress was far more dangerous. Emily pushed against the massive iron doors, her frozen fingers slipping against the cold wood. She stepped into the great hall, the air heavy with the scent of pine smoke and old steel. At the far end, Jaden sat motionless. He was the Alpha King, a man rumored to have a heart of jagged ice. His cold blue eyes pinned her to the stone floor. She had come only to mend his torn cloak, but as he stood, his massive frame casting a shadow over her tiny form, Emily realized the truth. She hadn't just walked into a fortress, she had walked into a trap from which there was no return. The wind swept harshly across the stone courtyard. Emily pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. She kept her gaze fixed on the icy cobblestones. Guards with iron spears watched her approach the main keep. They did not offer to open the heavy oak doors. Emily pushed against the rough wood with all her remaining strength. The heavy door groaned and yielded just enough for her to slip inside. Wards hit her face immediately. It was a sharp contrast to the brutal winter outside. She stood in the great hall of the northern fortress. The room was vast and mostly empty. A massive hearth blazed at the far end of the room. A man sat alone at a long wooden table. They called him the Alpha King. Jaden had earned that title through years of ruthless military campaigns. He was not a myth or a beast. He was simply a mortal warlord who had never lost a battle. Emily swallowed hard and took a hesitant step forward. Her worn leather boots made a soft, scuffling sound. Jaden did not look up from the parchment maps spread before him. His broad shoulders were tense beneath a simple black tunic. "You are the seamstress," he said. His voice was deep and carried easily across the large room. Emily stopped walking. "Yes, my lord," she replied. Her voice trembled slightly. She hated herself for showing fear. Jaden gestured vaguely toward a wooden bench near the fire. A heavy woolen cloak rested there. It was dark gray and stained with mud. A jagged tear ripped through the left shoulder. "Mend it," Jaden commanded. He still did not look at her. Emily walked quietly toward the bench. She knelt on the stone floor beside the heavy fabric. Her fingers were entirely numb from the long walk. She opened her small wooden sewing box. Inside sat her only tools. She retrieved a sturdy iron needle and a spool of thick thread. She tried to thread the needle. Her hands shook uncontrollably. The thread missed the eye of the needle 3 times. Emily closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She forced her muscles to steady. On the 4th attempt, the thread slid through. She tied a small knot and smoothed the torn edges of the cloak. The fabric smelled of pine smoke and old iron. She pushed the needle through the thick wool. It required more force than she anticipated. She pressed her thumb hard against the metal. The needle popped through the other side. She pulled the thread taut. She repeated the motion. The hall fell into a heavy silence. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the soft hiss of thread pulling through wool. Jaden finally lifted his head. He stared across the room at the woman working by the hearth. He saw a fragile figure swallowed by the oversized shadows of the room. Her dark hair was tied back loosely. Her dress was heavily patched and faded. She looked like a strong gust of wind would break her bones. Yet, she worked with an unyielding rhythm. Every stitch was precise. Every movement was calculated. She did not glance around the wealthy hall. She did not look at him. She simply focused entirely on the torn fabric. Jaden leaned back in his heavy wooden chair. He rubbed his tired eyes. He had spent the last 3 days managing a border dispute. He was exhausted and entirely out of patience. He had expected the village elder to send an experienced tailor. Instead, they sent this quiet, starving girl. He could see the sharp line of her jaw. Her cheeks were hollow. She was clearly underfed. Suddenly, a loud grumble echoed in the quiet room. Emily froze. Her needle stopped midair. Her stomach betrayed her hunger with another loud rumble. A deep flush of shame crept up her neck and colored her pale cheeks. She bit her bottom lip. She lowered her head further over the cloak. She desperately hoped the king had not heard it. Jaden heard it perfectly. He frowned slightly. He looked away from her and stared at the flames. He did not mock her. He did not say a word. He simply reached for a small silver bell on his table. He rang it once. The sharp chime broke the silence. Emily flinched at the sudden noise. A side door opened instantly. A servant bowed from the doorway. Jaden waved a hand dismissively. "Bring wood for the fire," Jaden ordered. He paused for a fraction of a second. "And bring the roasted meat from the kitchens." The servant bowed again and vanished. Emily kept her eyes firmly on her work. She pushed the needle through the tuft of fabric again. Her fingers ached horribly. The warmth of the fire was making her frozen skin sting. She welcomed the pain. It meant she was thawing. She finished the first row of stitches. She smoothed the seam with her thumb. It was perfectly flat and strong. She began the second reinforcement row. Her vision blurred slightly. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. She blinked hard to clear her sight. She could not afford to make a mistake. This job paid 1 silver coin. 1 silver coin meant firewood and bread for an entire month. She had to finish the task perfectly. The side door opened again. The servant returned carrying a large iron tray. The smell of roasted lamb filled the great hall instantly. Emily stopped breathing for a moment. Her mouth watered violently. Her stomach cramped with painful hunger. She forced herself to exhale slowly. She drove the needle back into the wool. The servant placed the tray on Jaden's table. He also placed a large loaf of crusty bread next to the meat. "Leave it," Jaden said. The servant left the room. Jaden picked up a small hunting knife. He sliced a generous piece of the lamb. He did not eat it. He set the knife down. He looked across the room at Emily. She was sewing faster now. Her posture was rigid. She was trying to ignore the food. It was a pathetic and admirable display of pride. Jaden stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the stone floor. Emily's shoulders tensed. She heard his heavy footsteps approaching. He walked slowly. He stopped a few feet away from her. Emily did not stop sewing. She was terrified he was coming to inspect the work early. She tied off the thread quickly. She reached for her iron scissors to cut the loose end. Her trembling hand knocked the scissors off the bench. They clattered loudly against the stone floor. Emily gasped quietly. She scrambled onto her knees to retrieve them. A large, scarred hand beat her to it. Jaden picked up the scissors. Emily knelt there, looking at his muddy leather boots. She slowly tilted her head up. She met his gaze for the first time. His eyes were a startling, cold blue. His face was weathered and marked by an old battle scar. He looked terrifying. He held out the scissors. Emily reached out with shaking fingers. She took the scissors from his palm. "Thank you, my lord," she whispered. Jaden looked at her hands. They were red, raw, and trembling. He looked at the cloak on the bench. The repair was flawless. It was stronger than the original weave. He looked back at her face. She was still waiting for his judgment. "The light is fading," Jaden said. His voice held no warmth, but no anger either. "You will ruin your eyes." Emily clutched the scissors tightly. "I am almost finished, my lord." She carefully cut the thread. She placed the scissors back into her wooden box. She stood up slowly. Her legs were stiff from kneeling. "The cloak is mended." She stepped back from the bench. She kept her hands clasped in front of her patched dress. Jaden did not inspect the cloak. He simply stared at her. He saw the exhaustion deeply etched into her youthful face. He saw the desperate pride keeping her standing straight. He turned around and walked back toward his table. Emily's heart sank. She waited for him to dismiss her without payment. It had happened before with lesser lords. Jaden reached into a leather pouch on his belt. He pulled out a silver coin. He tossed it onto the wooden table. It landed with a sharp clink next to the tray of meat. "Your payment," Jaden said. Emily exhaled a shaky breath of relief. She walked toward the table. Every step felt heavy. She reached out and took the silver coin. It felt cold and solid in her palm. "Thank you," she said softly. She turned to leave. She was desperate to escape the intoxicating smell of the food. She took 3 steps toward the heavy oak doors. "Wait," Jaden said. Emily stopped instantly. She did not turn around. Fear gripped her chest again. Had he found a flaw in the stitching? Did he want the coin back? She slowly turned to face him. Jaden was still standing by the table. He gestured to the empty wooden chair opposite him. The firelight danced across his hardened features. "It is dark outside," he stated plainly. He looked down at the roasted meat. He looked back up at her. "Stay for supper." Emily stared at him in pure shock. She could not process the command. The Alpha King did not dine with peasant seamstresses. The silence stretched between them. The wind howled against the stone wall outside, reminding them both of the freezing night. Emily stood frozen near the heavy oak doors. The wind battered the stone walls outside with renewed fury. She looked from the dark wood of the door back to the roaring hearth. Jaden remained standing by the long table. He did not repeat his invitation. He merely waited for her decision. Her pride warred bitterly with her empty stomach. Pride offered no warmth against the coming blizzard. She slowly walked back toward the fire. Her worn boots made no sound against the stone floor. She stopped beside the empty wooden chair. It was carved from dark oak and felt too grand for her small frame. "Sit," Jaden said. He sat down in his own chair at the head of the table. Emily lowered herself onto the very edge of the wooden seat. She kept her back perfectly straight. She folded her hands tightly in her lap. The tray of roasted lamb sat directly between them. The heat radiating from the meat warmed her face. Jaden picked up the iron knife. He sliced a thick piece of meat. He slid a wooden trencher across the table toward her. He placed the sliced meat onto her trencher. He then tore a large chunk from the crusty loaf of bread. He dropped the bread next to the meat. "Eat," he instructed quietly. Emily stared at the food. Her hands trembled as she reached for the bread. She tore a very small piece from the crust. She placed it in her mouth and chewed slowly. The rich flavor nearly brought tears to her eyes. She swallowed hard and forced herself not to devour the meal instantly. Hunger urged her to tear into the meat with her bare hands. Dignity forced her to use the small iron fork resting on the table. She cut a modest piece of lamb. She tasted the salt and the warm fat. It was the best thing she had eaten in years. Jaden watched her in silence. He cut his own portion of meat and ate methodically. He noticed how she kept her elbows tucked close to her sides. She took up as little physical space as possible. She acted like prey trying to hide in plain sight. He found her extreme caution both irritating and intriguing. Most people flattered him or cowered visibly in his presence. Emily did neither. She simply endured her reality. The great hall remained quiet except for the crackling fire. The warmth of the room slowly seeped into Emily's bones. Her physical trembling finally stopped. She finished her single slice of meat. She wiped her mouth gently with the back of her hand. She immediately realized her poor manners and lowered her hand. Jaden pushed the tray slightly closer to her. "There is more," he said. Emily shook her head gently. "I have had enough, thank you." It was a lie. She was still painfully hungry, but she did not want to appear greedy. Jaden knew she was lying. He did not press the issue. He reached for the heavy wine pitcher resting near the fire. He grabbed the thick clay handle. As he lifted the pitcher, his grip slipped slightly. A sharp hiss escaped his lips. Emily looked up in sudden surprise. Jaden set the pitcher down hard on the table. He rubbed the back of his right hand. Emily noticed a deep, jagged scar running across his knuckles. The bitter cold weather had caused the old skin to crank open. A thin line of fresh blood welled up along the broken seam. It smeared against his thumb as he flexed his fingers. Jaden ignored the blood and reached for the pitcher again. "You are bleeding," Emily said. The words left her mouth before she could stop them. Jaden paused. He looked at his hand indifferently. "It is nothing." He poured the dark wine into a metal cup. The blood smeared against the rim of the cup. Emily watched the red drop trail down his skin. She thought about the brutal cold outside these walls. She knew how easily a small wound could fester and rot in winter. She reached into the deep pocket of her patched dress. Her fingers found a small square of folded cloth. It was made of coarse linen, but it was entirely clean. She had washed it with melted snow just that morning. She pulled the cloth from her pocket. She stood up slightly from her wooden chair. She leaned across the wide table. She held out the folded linen toward him. Jaden looked at the plain cloth. He looked up at her face. Her eyes held no fear or hidden calculation. They only held a quiet, genuine concern. "Take it," Emily urged softly. She pushed the cloth a little closer to his scarred hand. "The cold will make the wound angry." Jaden stared at her outstretched arm. Her skin was pale and heavily marked with needle pricks. She was offering him her own meager possession. He was a sovereign king who commanded entire armies. He possessed iron chests filled with gold and fine silk. Yet, this starving girl was trying to care for him. He slowly reached out across the table. He took the linen cloth from her thin fingers. Their hands brushed for a mere fraction of a second. Her skin felt incredibly soft despite the harsh weather. He pressed the cloth against his bleeding knuckles. The rough fabric stung the open cut, but it absorbed the blood quickly. Emily sat back down in her chair. She folded her hands tightly in her lap once more. "Thank you," Jaden said. His voice was distinctly lower than before. It lacked the sharp edge of military command. Emily nodded simply. She kept her eyes focused respectfully on the wooden table. Jaden kept the cloth pressed firmly to his hand. He realized the great hall did not feel as desolate as usual. The physical presence of this quiet woman altered the space. He looked at the perfectly mended cloak resting on the bench. He looked at the empty trencher sitting in front of her. He made a sudden, uncharacteristic decision. He reached into his leather pouch again.
He pulled out a second silver coin. He slid it across the wooden table. It stopped just inches from her folded hands. Emily looked at the coin in deep confusion. My lord, you have already paid me. Jaden picked up his wine cup with his left hand. The first coin was for the cloak. He took a slow drink of the dark wine. The second coin is for a new task. Emily looked up, her confusion deepening into worry. I do not understand. My winter wardrobe is in ruins, Jaden lied smoothly. His royal tunics were in absolute perfect condition. He had 3 master tailors on permanent retainer in the capital. I require someone to mend the rest of my heavy garments. Emily stared at him. Surely the castle has skilled tailors on staff. They are completely busy preparing canvas for the spring campaign. Jaden set his metal cup down on the table. You work quickly and quietly. He pointed toward the heavy wooden doors. The roads are closed by the deep snow anyway. He met her gaze directly. You will stay in the fortress until the work is fully done. Emily's heart hammered painfully against her ribs. She had no food or firewood left at her tiny village hut. Returning home meant facing the brutal freeze entirely alone. Staying here meant physical safety, steady warmth, and secure work. But it also meant sleeping under the same roof as the most dangerous man in the kingdom. She looked down at the bright silver coin on the table. She thought about the howling wind rattling the glass windows. Where will I sleep? She asked cautiously. Jaden recognized the quiet acceptance in her tone. The head housekeeper will find you a warm room near the kitchens. He stood up from the long table. You begin your work tomorrow morning. He turned and walked away from the table. He headed toward the dark stone stairs at the back of the great hall. He carried her small linen cloth with him in his hand. Emily sat alone in the large, firelit hall. She looked at the 2 silver coins shining against the dark wood. She had come here expecting careless cruelty or swift dismissal. She had found an unexpected sanctuary instead. She reached out and picked up the second coin. It felt just as heavy and real as the first one. She closed her cold fingers tightly around the warm silver. The fire crackled steadily in the stone hearth. For the first time in months, she did not feel the biting cold. Morning light filtered through the small, high window. Emily opened her eyes and stared at the stone ceiling. She lay still for a long moment. She waited for the familiar ache of the freezing cold. The cold never came. The thick woolen blankets trapped her body heat perfectly. She sat up and rubbed her face. A small fire burned steadily in the iron grate across the room. The head housekeeper had assigned her this modest chamber near the kitchens. It smelled faintly of dried herbs and baked bread. Emily dressed quickly in her worn garments. She washed her face with warm water from a ceramic basin. She made her way back to the great hall. The massive room was busier than it had been the previous night. Servants swept the stone floors and polished the wooden tables. Jaden sat at his usual place by the main hearth. He was speaking quietly with 2 older military commanders. Emily kept her head down and walked to the wooden bench. A heavy pile of dark garments waited for her. She opened her wooden sewing box and prepared her needle. She picked up a torn linen shirt and examined the frayed edges. Her hands moved with practiced speed. The dull hum of political discussions provided a steady background noise. Nobody paid attention to the quiet woman sewing in the corner. Emily preferred the anonymity. It allowed her to focus entirely on earning her silver coins. 2 hours passed in comfortable silence. The commanders eventually bowed and left the hall. Jaden remained at his table reading a stack of parchment letters. He occasionally glanced toward the bench. Emily was hunched over a thick leather vest. She used a sharp awl to pierce the tough hide before threading the needle. Her brow furrowed in concentration. Heavy footsteps echoed loudly from the entryway. A tall soldier marched into the great hall. He wore chainmail and carried a snow-covered helmet at his arm. His boots left dirty puddles on the clean stone. He looked around the room and spotted Emily. He walked directly toward her bench. Emily paused her stitching and looked up nervously. The soldier carried a heavy canvas tent flap. It was slashed down the middle and caked in frozen mud. He dropped the foul-smelling canvas right at her feet. Dust and dirt scattered across her neat work area. "Fix this," the soldier demanded loudly. His voice was rough and held an obvious layer of contempt. Emily looked at the filthy canvas. "I am sorry, sir," she said softly. She kept her voice as polite as possible. "I was hired to mend the Lord's personal garments." The soldier scoffed and crossed his arms. "You are a hired hand, eating our food." He kicked the canvas closer to her boots. "You will fix the camp tents, just like the other servants." Emily swallowed hard. She did not want to cause any trouble. She reached down to pick up the heavy fabric. "Leave it." The deep voice cut through the air like a physical blade. The soldier stiffened instantly and spun around. Jaden stood up from his table. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the iron sword at his hip. He simply walked slowly toward the soldier. The atmosphere in the room grew suffocatingly dense. The soldier lowered his head and took a step back. "My lord," the soldier stammered. Jaden stopped 2 feet away from the man. He looked down at the dirty canvas on the floor. He then looked at the mud tracked across the clean stone. "Did I issue an order regarding the tents?" Jaden asked. His tone was dangerously calm. The soldier broke out in a cold sweat. "No, my lord." "Did you consult my quartermaster before delegating tasks in my hall?" The soldier swallowed loudly. "I did not, my lord." Jaden shifted his gaze to the soldier's face. His blue eyes were utterly devoid of warmth. "You track filth into my hall." He pointed a scarred finger at the canvas. "You throw garbage at my seamstress." He let the word hang in the silent room. "You presume to speak for me." The soldier dropped to one knee. His armor clattered against the stone floor. "Forgive me," the soldier pleaded. Emily clutched her sewing tools tightly against her chest. She had never seen a large man cower so pitifully. Jaden looked down at the kneeling man with clear disgust. "Pick up the canvas," Jaden ordered. The soldier scrambled to gather the heather fabric into his arms. "Report to the outer wall." Jaden turned his back on the man. "You will take the night watch for the next month." The soldier bowed his head quickly. "Yes, my lord." He rushed out of the hall without looking back. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him. The room fell quiet again. Jaden looked at the dirt scattered on the floor near Emily's bench. He motioned for a servant hiding near the stairs. "Clean this," he instructed briefly. The servant hurried forward with a broom. Jaden turned his attention back to Emily. She was staring at him with wide, cautious eyes. She slowly lowered her sewing tools into her lap. "Thank you," she whispered. Jaden noticed her pale fingers gripping the fabric. He hated the fear lingering in her posture. "You do not take orders from the garrison," he stated firmly. He closed the distance between them. He stopped near the wooden bench. "You answer only to me." Emily nodded slowly. She understood the gravity of his words. He was drawing a protective circle around her. It was a strange feeling. She was accustomed to being entirely invisible. Society had always treated her as a disposable burden. Yet this powerful man demanded respect for her presence. Jaden looked down at the tough leather vest in her hands. "That hide is too thick for a standard needle," he observed. Emily looked down at her work. I have an awl, she replied. She showed him the small metal tool. It is slow work, but it gets the job done. Jaden shook his head slightly. You will ruin your hands before evening. He reached into his own tunic. He pulled out a small, leather-wrapped package. He held it out to her. Emily hesitated before taking it. She unwrapped the soft leather carefully. Inside lay a set of fine bone needles and a silver thimble. The tools were masterfully crafted. They belonged to an artisan, not a village seamstress. They were left behind by a traveling merchant. Jaden lied. He had actually confiscated them from a corrupt supply master years ago. Use them. Emily touched the smooth surface of the silver thimble. It fit her finger perfectly. These are very valuable, she said softly. She looked up at him. I cannot accept such a gift. It is not a gift, Jaden countered smoothly. It is an investment in your work. He turned and walked back to his table. He picked up his parchment letters. I expect perfection from my staff. Emily watched him sit down in his heavy wooden chair. A small, tentative smile touched her lips. She recognized the gentle lie hiding behind his stern command. She placed the silver thimble on her finger. She threaded the fine bone needle. It pierced the thick leather with incredible ease. The pain in her fingers immediately lessened. She resumed her work with renewed energy. The great hall no longer felt vast and intimidating. The crackling fire sounded like a cheerful melody. Jaden continued reading his letters. He did not look up again. He simply listened to the steady, rhythmic sound of her sewing. The blizzard raged outside the stone walls. Inside, the fortress felt surprisingly peaceful.
The afternoon hours slipped away unnoticed. The harsh gray light outside the window slowly faded into dusk. Servants entered the hall to light the iron wall sconces. Emily stretched her tired neck and rubbed her shoulders. She had repaired 4 heavy tunics and the leather vest. She neatly folded the finished garments and stacked them on the bench. She carefully cleaned her new bone needles and wrapped them in leather. She placed the tools back into her wooden box. Jaden signed the final parchment and pushed his inkwell aside. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked across the room. "Are you finished for the day?" he asked. His voice broke the long stretch of silence comfortably. Emily stood up and smoothed her skirt. "I am, my lord." She gestured to the neat stack of clothing. "They are ready." Jaden did not inspect the work. "Leave them." He stood up and stretched his broad shoulders. "The kitchens will be serving supper soon." Emily hesitated for a moment. She wondered if she should retreat to her small room. She did not want to overstep her bounds. "You will eat here," Jaden added casually. He read the uncertainty on her face easily. "I dislike eating in an empty hall." Emily nodded. She walked slowly toward the long wooden table. She sat in the same chair she had used the previous night. It felt slightly less imposing this time. Jaden sat opposite her. A servant arrived quickly with 2 steaming bowls of thick stew. He placed a loaf of bread and a pitcher of water between them. The servant left without a word. Emily picked up her wooden spoon. She ate slowly and savored the rich taste of root vegetables and beefs. She no longer felt the desperate panic of starvation. She felt full and surprisingly safe. Jaden watched her eat in quiet contentment. He noticed the silver thimble still resting on the table near her hand. He reached for his glass of water. He realized he was actually looking forward to tomorrow. The blizzard raged for 3 unbroken days. Snow piled high against the lower fortress windows.
The great hall became a warm sanctuary against the desolate world outside. Emily worked steadily through the towering pile of heavy winter garments. She established a quiet routine within the stone walls. She woke with the dawn and sewed until the firelight faded. Jaden was a constant presence at his long wooden table. He governed his harsh territory while she mended his armor undergarments. They rarely spoke during the busy daylight hours. Their shared silence had grown comfortable rather than oppressive. On the fourth afternoon, Emily reached the bottom of the unwashed laundry basket. Her fingers brushed against something entirely different from the rough wool and hardened leather. She pulled out a small piece of fabric. It was a child's cloak woven from fine, dark thread. The edges were badly charred and brittle from old fire damage. A deep, jagged rip tore right through the center of the tiny garment. Emily stared at the ruined cloth. It was far too small for any soldier in the garrison. It held the distinct smell of old ash and deep sorrow. She laid the fragile fabric onto her wooden bench. She ran her fingers gently over the burned edges. Someone had carefully folded and preserved this ruined thing for decades. She threaded her bone needle with the finest black silk she possessed. She leaned close to the fabric and began to carefully stitch the jagged tear. Heavy footsteps abruptly halted near her bench. "What are you doing?" Jaden's voice cracked through the quiet hall like a physical whip. Emily gasped and dropped her hands into her lap. She looked up to find him towering over her workspace. His blue eyes were wide and locked onto the tiny cloak. A dark, dangerous fury rolled off his broad shoulders. He stepped forward and snatched the small garment from the bench. "Who told you to touch this?" he demanded. His tone held a raw edge of panic she had never heard before. Emily pressed her back against the cold stone wall. "It was in the bottom of the basket, my lord." She kept her voice remarkably steady despite her racing heart. "I thought it required mending like the rest of the pile." Jaden clutched the charred fabric against his wide chest. His knuckles turned white from the sheer force of his grip. He looked like a wounded animal backed into a dark corner. He was the sovereign ruler of the North, yet this small piece of cloth reduced him to a defensive survivor. "It does not require mending," he stated harshly. He glared down at her pale face. "You overstep your boundaries." He turned away abruptly. He walked quickly toward the roaring hearth. Emily watched him stand before the tall flames. He stared into the fire with impossibly rigid shoulders. He looked utterly isolated in the vast room. Most servants would have apologized profusely and run from the hall in terror. Emily did not run. She recognized the defensive anger masking an old, agonizing pain. She had worn that exact same mask when she lost her mother to the winter fever. She stood up slowly from her wooden bench. She walked across the stone floor toward the fire. She stopped just a few paces behind his imposing figure. The intense heat from the hearth warmed her face. "A torn thread will eventually unravel the whole garment," Emily said softly. Jaden stiffened visibly but did not turn around. "Leave me," he ordered. Emily did not retreat a single step. "My mother told me that before she died," she continued quietly. "She said we must repair what is broken before it is lost entirely." Jaden turned his head slightly. He looked at her over his broad shoulder. "Some things cannot be fixed." His voice sounded hollow and impossibly weary. Emily took one cautious step closer. She looked at the small cloak crushed in his scarred hand. The fire took the edges, she acknowledged. But the core of the weave is still very strong. She looked up into his cold blue eyes. I was only trying to close the tear so the cold would not get in. Jaden stared at her calm, earnest face. He searched her expression for pity or morbid curiosity. He found only a profound, quiet understanding. She understood the terrible weight of carrying ancient ghosts. He slowly relaxed his tight grip on the dark fabric. The tiny cloak dropped slightly in his hand. I was 7 years old, Jaden said. The words seemed to cost him a great deal of physical effort. Emily remained perfectly still and listened. Rival warlords burned our ancestral estate to the ground. He looked back into the orange flames of the hearth. My father met me in the cellar before the burning roof collapsed. He lifted the charred cloth slightly toward the light. This was all I managed to drag out of the heavy ashes. Emily felt a sharp, empathetic ache in her own chest. She understood now why the mighty king never lost a battle. He fought every war as if his childhood home was still burning. She reached out her hand slowly. She stopped midway, offering him the silent choice to pull away. Jaden watched her hand hover in the open space between them. He did not move back. Emily gently placed her fingers over his scarred hand holding the cloak. Her touch was feather-light and completely devoid of threat. "You survived the fire," Emily whispered. She gently tugged on the edge of the fabric. "Let me finish closing the tear." Jaden looked down at their touching hands. Her small, pale fingers looked incredibly fragile against his hardened skin. Yet, her gentle grip felt remarkably steady and grounding. He slowly released his firm hold on the old garment. Emily took the child's cloak back to her wooden bench. She sat down and smoothed the fabric carefully across her knees. She picked up her fine bone needle again. Jaden did not return to his large table. He walked over and stood beside her low bench. He watched her work in complete silence. Her stitches were tiny, meticulous, and incredibly strong. She used the black silk to bind the frayed edges of the tear together. The dark thread blended seamlessly with the original ancient weave. The jagged hole slowly disappeared under her highly skilled hands. It took nearly an hour to finish the delicate repair process. The hall was utterly quiet, except for the wind howling outside the walls. Emily finally snipped the end of the silk thread with her iron scissors. She smoothed the closed seam with her thumb. She held the tiny cloak up to the warm firelight. The garment was still deeply scarred by the ancient fire. The dark burn marks remained completely untouched. However, the deep tear that split the center was entirely gone. The fabric was functionally whole again. She folded the cloak neatly. She turned and handed it up to Jaden. He took it from her with surprising physical gentleness. He ran his thumb over the nearly invisible seam. It felt remarkably smooth and secure against his rough skin. He looked down at the quiet woman sitting on the bench. She was carefully packing her fine bone needles back into their leather wrap. She did not demand thanks or expect any kind of reward. She had simply offered her skill to ease a pain she clearly recognized. "You are highly skilled," Jaden finally said. Emily closed the lid of her wooden box. "Hunger makes a fast learner, my lord." Jaden frowned slightly at her brutal, practical honesty. He hated the sudden thought of her starving in a freezing village hut. He hated the idea of her leaving when the snow finally melted. He walked back to his long wooden table. He placed the folded child's cloak carefully next to his parchment maps. He did not hide it away in the dark this time. "The blizzard is breaking," Jaden noted. He looked toward the high stone window. The howling wind had dropped to a low, steady moan.
The main roads will be clear in 2 days. Femla felt a sudden, sharp drop in her stomach. Her time in this warm sanctuary was rapidly coming to an end. She had successfully repaired all the heavy garments in the basket. Her temporary purpose here was strictly fulfilled. "I will gather my things tomorrow morning," Emily said quietly. She kept her eyes firmly fixed on the gray stone floor. "I have earned enough silver to survive the rest of the bitter winter." Jaden sat down heavily in his wooden chair. He watched her staring at the cold floor. He recognized the familiar, painful resignation in her defeated posture. She fully expected to be cast out into the unforgiving cold again. He leaned forward and rested his muscular arms on the table. "The fortress is vast," Jaden stated casually. "My ancestral tapestries are severely fraying." He picked up his metal wine cup and inspected the rim. The heavy winter drapes in the upper corridors require extensive structural reinforcement. Emily looked up slowly. She blinked in pure, undisguised confusion. "My lord?" "Your work is barely adequate," Jaden lied with a perfectly straight face. Her work was actually nothing short of a miracle. "I require a permanent seamstress on my personal staff." Emily stopped breathing entirely for a long second. A permanent position in the main keep meant reliable, steady wages. It meant a warm bed, daily meals, and absolute physical safety. It was a level of security a village orphan could not even properly dream of. "You would hire me permanently?" she asked. Her voice wavered slightly, betraying her desperate, hidden hope. "I would," Jaden confirmed firmly. He set his metal cup down on the dark wood. "The position pays 4 silver coins a month." He met her wide, disbelieving blue eyes. "You will also receive full daily provisions and keep your current heated chamber." Emily clutched her pale hands together tightly in her lap. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but she firmly refused to let them fall. "I accept the position, my lord," she managed to say. "I will not disappoint you." Jaden leaned back in his chair. A heavy, unseen weight instantly lifted from his broad shoulders. The thought of the great hall returning to its former crushing emptiness had troubled him deeply. "See that you do not," he replied softly. He picked up his stack of parchment letters once again. Emily sat back down on her wooden bench. She rested her hands calmly on her lap. The suffocating fear of the coming winter had completely vanished from her mind. She looked across the large room at the imposing ruler. He was no longer just a terrifying, untouchable warlord to her. He was a man who carefully preserved a burned cloak to remember his roots. He was a man who quietly offered sanctuary under the practical guise of employment. The fire crackled merrily in the large stone hearth. The dark, imposing fortress finally felt like a real home. The heavy oak doors swung open to reveal a blindingly white landscape. The long blizzard had finally broken. Pale sunlight poured into the gloomy stone hall. Soldiers shouted sharp orders in the frozen courtyard outside. They worked tirelessly to clear the massive snowdrifts blocking the gates. Emily sat in her usual corner near the roaring hearth. She was diligently reinforcing the seams of a heavy wool blanket. Jaden studied a wide parchment map at his long wooden table. The peaceful morning routine shattered when 4 soldiers stomped heavily into the room. They brought a bitter draft of winter air with them. The lead soldier carried a small bundle wrapped in a coarse gray blanket. He stepped forward and set the bundle gently onto a wooden bench. The thick wool fell away to reveal a young boy. He looked no older than 6 years. His ragged clothes were soaked through with melted snow. He shivered violently against the hard wood. "We found him near the western pass," the soldier reported.
Jaden looked up from his scattered maps. "Explain the situation," Jaden demanded. His settlement was buried under an avalanche during the final night of the storm. The soldier looked down at the boy with awkward pity. He was wandering along the tree line looking for shelter. Jaden walked slowly toward the bench. He stood over the shivering child in silence. The boy shrank back against the rough backrest. He stared at Jaden's scarred face with wide, terrified eyes. The child had clearly survived a terrible ordeal. The objective cruelty of the harsh winter had spared his life, but stolen his home. Jaden felt a familiar, dull ache tight in his chest. He remembered the bitter cold of his own childhood tragedy. Emily jabbed her bone needle directly onto her lap. She stood up and hurried across the cold stone floor. She pushed past the armed soldiers without a single hesitation. She knelt carefully in front of the small boy. "Bring me a warm basin of water and a clean towel," Emily ordered the nearest guard. The soldier blinked in genuine surprise at her sudden tone of authority. He looked toward Jaden for official confirmation. Jaden gave a short, sharp nod. The soldier rushed quickly toward the castle kitchens. Emily reached out and gently touched the boy's frozen hands. His skin felt icy and worryingly pale. "What is your name?" she asked softly. Her tone was calm and remarkably steady. She did not use a high-pitched or childish voice. She spoke to him with quiet, solemn respect. The boy sniffled and rubbed his dirty cheek. "Leo," he whispered into the quiet hall. "You are safe now, Leo," Emily assured him. She unwrapped his sodden, freezing outer tunic. She pulled her own dry woolen shawl from her shoulders. She wrapped it securely around his small, trembling frame. The soldier returned quickly with a steaming ceramic basin and a folded linen cloth. Emily took the cloth and dipped it into the warm water. She carefully washed the frozen mud from Leo's small face. She cleaned his raw hands with slow, deliberate motions. Jaden watched the scene unfold in profound silence. He saw the natural, unhesitating grace in her movements. She was offering this broken orphan the exact same unconditional care she had offered him. She possessed nothing of material value, yet she freely gave away her own warmth to comfort another wounded soul. "The village orphanage is a day's ride south," the lead soldier suggested bluntly. "We can take him there when the main road fully clears." Emily paused her gentle washing. Her hand hovered motionless over the warm basin. She knew the grim reality of village orphanages during the brutal winter months. Food was always scarce and heavily rationed. Disease spread rapidly in the cramped, unheated buildings. A traumatized boy like Leo would rarely survive until the spring thaw. She looked up directly at Jaden. She did not speak a single word of protest. Her blue eyes held a desperate, silent plea. She was begging the powerful ruler for simple mercy. Jaden looked from Emily's pleading face to the shivering boy. Leo was clutching Emily's woolen shawl tightly in his small fists. The child pressed his face against her side for physical comfort. He instinctively sought her gentle presence for protection against the armored men. Jaden turned to gaze back to the lead soldier. "The roads are still too dangerous for civilian travel," Jaden stated flatly. "He will not survive the rough journey south." The soldier frowned in obvious confusion. "Then what shall we do with him, my lord?" Jaden looked back at Emily. A silent, heavy understanding passed between them. "He stays here," Jaden commanded. The soldiers exchanged bewildered glances with one another. The northern fortress was a strict military garrison. It was no place for a soft, wandering child to live. "Where will he sleep?" the soldier dared to ask. "He will sleep in the seamstress's quarters," Jaden answered smoothly. He stepped closer to the wooden bench. She will be responsible for his daily care. Emily let out a long, shuddering breath of profound relief. A radiant, genuine smile broke across her tired face. It was the first time Jaden had ever seen her truly smile. The subtle beauty of it caught him entirely off guard. He felt a strange, warm flutter deep in his chest. "Thank you," Emily whispered softly. Jaden offered a brief, subtle nod. He turned to address the waiting soldiers again. Dismissed. The armored men bowed swiftly and left the great hall. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them. The vast room returned to its peaceful quiet. Emily lifted Leo into her arms with practiced ease. The boy was worryingly light. He rested his tired head against her shoulder and closed his eyes. "I will take him to my room and find him some dry clothes," Emily said. She looked down at his dirty, worn leather boots. "He needs a hot meal to restore his strength." Jaden gestured toward the far hallway leading to the domestic wing. "The kitchen staff will provide whatever you require for his recovery." Emily carried the sleeping boy toward the dark stone corridor. She moved slowly to avoid waking him from his exhausted slumber. Jaden watched them disappear into the long shadows. He walked back to his table and sat down heavily in his chair. He picked up his metal quill to resume Rahim's military orders. His mind fiercely refused to focus on troop formations and supply lines. He kept seeing the gentle way Emily had wrapped her shawl around the freezing boy. He kept remembering the deep gratitude shining in her eyes. She had looked at him as a steadfast protector, not a monster. He set the metal quill down on the parchment. He rubbed the old, jagged scar across his knuckles. The great hall felt distinctly different this morning. It was no longer just a cold command center for a ruthless war. It felt like something fragile and precious was taking root within the ancient stone walls. An hour later, Emily returned to the main hall. She did not bring her wooden sewing box this time. She held Leo firmly by his small hand. The boy wore a clean linen shirt that belonged to a servant. The sleeves were rolled up high past his small elbows. His face was scrubbed clean and his dark hair was neatly combed. He looked deeply tired but remarkably calm. Emily led him slowly toward the roaring fire. "He is afraid of the dark room," she explained apologetically. "He asked to stay out here near the light." Jaden studied the small boy from his seat. "Sit by the fire," Jaden instructed softly. His deep voice startled the child slightly. Leo hid quickly behind Emily's patched skirt. Emily patted his head reassuringly with her soft hand. She guided him to the warm stone hearth. She sat down on the floor beside him. A servant soon arrived carrying a tray of warm chicken broth and soft bread. Emily took a wooden spoon and fed the boy patiently. Leo swallowed the warm liquid with eager hunger. Jaden observed the steady, comforting rhythm of her care. He watched her tear the bread into tiny, manageable pieces. She murmured quiet words of encouragement between every bite. The boy slowly relaxed his tense shoulders. He began to lean into her warmth with genuine trust. Emily finished feeding him and set the empty bowl aside. She pulled a small measuring string from her pocket. She carefully measured the width of the boy's narrow shoulders. She looked across the room at the imposing ruler. "My lord," Emily began hesitantly. Jaden met her gaze and waited for her request. "He has no warm clothes of his own." She gestured to the oversized linen shirt. "May I use the discarded fabric in the storeroom to fashion him a proper tunic?" Jaden leaned back in his heavy oak chair. He thought about the massive bolts of fine wool locked away in the lower vaults. "Take whatever material you need," Jaden commanded gently. He pointed toward the heavy wooden chest near the stairs. "There is deep blue wool in that trunk. He held her surprised gaze. It is dense enough to block the winter wind. Emily nodded with quiet, immense gratitude. She knew the blue wool was highly expensive and meant only for officers. She picked up her scissors and walked toward the heavy chest. Leo stayed seated by the fire, watching the flames dance. Jaden reached for a small wooden bowl resting on his table. It contained a handful of sweet, dried apples from the southern provinces. It was a rare and costly luxury in the frozen north. He stood up and walked toward the warm hearth. He stopped just a few feet away from the quiet boy. He knelt down slowly on one knee against the hard stone. The movement put him perfectly at eye level with the child. He held out the wooden bowl without saying a word. Leo looked away from the fire and stared at the bowl. He looked at the dried fruit with wide, curious eyes. He slowly reached out a small hand and took a piece of apple. He put it in his mouth and chewed tentatively. A bright spark of innocent joy lit up his dark eyes. He bravely reached out for another sweet piece. Jaden stood up and left the bowl resting on the hearth. He returned to his long table and picked up his quill again. He felt a profound sense of peace settle over his turbulent mind. He had spent his entire life building impenetrable walls to keep the harsh world out. He had never expected someone to quietly build a warm home inside those very walls. The deep northern night wrapped the fortress in heavy blackness. Most of the garrison slept soundly beneath thick woolen blankets. Emily tossed restlessly on her narrow cot. Her physical exhaustion constantly battled against a lingering, anxious wakefulness. The small stone chamber felt unusually warm despite the winter chill outside. Leo lay curled beside her small flame. His breathing sounded uneven in the quiet room. He mumbled broken words in his troubled sleep. Suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the peaceful silence. Leo thrashed violently against the linen sheets. His small hands clawed desperately at the empty air. Emily sat up instantly. She reached out to gather the terrified boy into her arms. He fought against her gentle hold with surprising strength. The trauma of the roaring avalanche gripped his fragile mind. He kicked his legs and sobbed uncontrollably. "Leo, you are safe," Emily whispered repeatedly. She rocked him back and forth in the dark room. Tears streamed down his flushed cheeks. He cried out for a mother who would never answer him again. Emily felt her own tears own the corners of her eyes. She remembered the exact taste of that specific, helpless grease. She hummed a low, soothing melody to calm his racing heart.
The boy continued to cry out in blind panic. Heavy footsteps echoed sharply down the stone corridor outside. The wooden door to her small chamber creaked open. Jaden stood in the dark threshold. He wore simple dark trousers and a loose linen shirt. A brass candlestick rested in his left hand. The flickering orange light cast long shadows across his scarred face. He stepped into the cramped room without asking permission. Emily looked up at him with wide, desperate eyes. "He is having a nightmare," she explained breathlessly. She tried again to smooth the boy's damp hair. "I am sorry for waking you, my lord." Leo continued to sob hysterically against her shoulder. Jaden set the brass candle down on a small wooden table. He walked over to the narrow cot. He did not look angry at the sudden disturbance. Instead, a profoundly serious expression settled on his features. Jaden knelt down on the cold stone floor beside them. The warlord's massive frame dwarfed the small wooden bed. "Leo," he said. His voice rumbled low and deep in the small space. It carried the grounded weight of a falling mountain. The crying boy gasped and opened his swollen eyes. He stared at the imposing man kneeling beside him. "The snow cannot reach you here," Jaden stated firmly.
He reached out a scarred hand. He did not touch the boy quickly or forcefully. The large hand came to rest gently on the edge of the blanket. I have built these walls from solid iron and heavy stone. He held the child's terrified gaze with calm authority. Nothing enters this fortress without my direct permission. Leo sniffled loudly and loosened his tight grip on Emily's tunic. Not even the snow, the boy whispered. Jaden shook his head slowly. Not even the winter wind. He shifted his weight slightly on the hard floor. You are under my protection now. The steady certainty in his tone acted like a physical shield. Leo blinked slowly as the panic finally left his small body. He reached out and touched Jaden's scarred knuckles. The warlord did not pull away from the innocent contact. He simply turned his hand over and gently supported the boy's small fingers. Emily watched this exchange with a tight, aching chest. She witnessed a side of Jaden that nobody else ever saw. The ruthless ruler of the North was quietly soothing a broken orphan. He offered strength to those who possessed none. Leo finally closed his eyes again. His breathing smoothed out into a deep, steady rhythm. He fell back into a peaceful sleep within minutes. Jaden slowly withdrew his hand from the boy's grasp. He stood up from the cold floor. He picked up the brass candle from the table. Thank you, Emily murmured softly. She pulled the warm blanket up to Leo's chin. Jaden looked down at her exhausted face in the dim light. You need to sleep, he noted quietly. I will rest now, she promised. He lingered in the doorway for a fraction of a second. He nodded once and closed the door softly behind him. The next morning brought a flurry of unexpected activity to the courtyard. A loud horn sounded from the outer watchtower. Emily sat in the great hall stitching a new blue tunic for Leo. She enjoyed the smooth texture of the expensive wool. She paused her work and looked toward the heavy oak doors. Jaden stood by his long table inspecting a steel blade. He sheathed the sword quickly as a guard rushed into the room. Lord Vincent of the Southern Marches has arrived, the guard announced. Jaden frowned deeply at the news. He is 2 weeks early, Jaden muttered. He walked toward the center of the vast hall. The heavy doors swung open to admit the visiting nobleman. Lord Vincent wore a pristine velvet cloak trimmed with white fur. He walked with a noticeable swagger that demanded immediate attention. 4 armed guards followed closely behind him. Their shiny armor contrasted sharply with the battle-worn gear of the northern garrison. Vincent stopped a few feet away from Jaden and offered a shallow bow. The spring thaw arrived early in the south, Vincent declared loudly. He smiled, but the expression did not reach his pale eyes. I decided to deliver the trade agreements personally. Jaden crossed his arms over his broad chest. You are welcome to rest your horses, Jaden offered formally. He did not return the shallow smile. Vincent turned his head to survey the austere northern hall. His gaze swept past the blazing hearth and the empty tables. His eyes landed squarely on Emily. She sat quietly on her wooden bench in the corner. Leo played silently on the floor near her feet with a wooden block. Vincent curled his lip in obvious disgust. He walked slowly toward her small workspace. Emily lowered her eyes respectfully and continued sewing. She focused on keeping her stitches perfectly straight. Your standards have fallen drastically, Vincent mocked. He looked back over his shoulder at Jaden. You allow common vagrants to occupy the main hall? He pointed a gloved finger at Emily's patched dress. She smells of cheap wool and peasant dirt. Emily felt a familiar cold shame wash over her. She shrank inward and gripped her bone needle tightly. She prayed silently for the man to simply walk away. Leo stopped playing and moved closer to Emily's leg.
He sensed the hostility radiating from the Southern Lord. Vincent noticed the boy and sneered openly. "And a street rat to complete the pitiful scene," Vincent added. He stepped closer and kicked the wooden block away. It skittered loudly across the stone floor. Leo flinched and buried his face in Emily's skirt. Emily threw a protective arm around the trembling child. She glared up at the noble with sudden defensive anger. She would accept insults directed at herself without a fight. She would not tolerate cruelty directed at the innocent boy. Before she could speak, a dark shadow fell over them both. Jaden materialized beside the nobleman with terrifying speed. He did not draw his steel sword. Instead, his bare hands grabbed the front of Vincent's velvet cloak. The sudden movement lifted the nobleman forcefully onto his toes. Vincent gasped and clawed at the iron grip choking him. His 4 armed guards drew their blades instinctively. "Sheathe your steel," Jaden commanded the guards. His voice was low, lethal, and vibrating with dark rage. "Or you will leave this fortress in wooden boxes." The Southern guards hesitated and looked at their struggling lord. They saw the murderous intent burning in Jaden's cold eyes. Reluctantly, the soldiers lowered their weapons in genuine fear. Jaden turned his deadly focus back to Vincent's pale face. "This woman is under my direct protection." He leaned in closer until their faces nearly touched. "This child eats at my table." He twisted the velvet fabric tighter around Vincent's throat. "You will speak to them with the exact respect you owe me." Vincent nodded frantically. His face turned an unhealthy shade of red. "I understand," Vincent choked out. Jaden released his grip suddenly. The nobleman stumbled backward and caught his balance against a wooden pillar. He rubbed his bruised neck and breathed heavily. "My apologies," Vincent managed to wheeze. He did not look at Emily or Leo again. Jaden pointed toward the main entryway of the hall. "The steward will show you to your guest quarters." He stared at the Southern Lord with cold, unblinking eyes. "Do not return to this hall until you are summoned." Vincent straightened his ruined collar hastily. He turned and practically ran toward the heavy oak doors. His armed escort hurried out right behind him. The heavy wood slammed shut. The massive room fell perfectly silent once again. Emily sat on her bench with a rapidly beating heart. She held Leo tightly against her side. She had never seen someone defend her honor with such brutal clarity. Society always taught her to accept the insults of her betters. Jaden proved that those cruel rules held no power here. He turned his back to the closed doors and looked at her. The lethal anger vanished instantly from his hardened features. He reached down and picked up the discarded wooden block. He wiped a speck of dust from the smooth wood. He handed it gently back to the frightened boy. "Continue your work," Jaden told Emily softly. He walked back to his long table as if nothing had happened. Emily watched him sit down and resume his inspection of the sword. A profound, fierce loyalty bloomed deep within her chest. She realized she would gladly stitch the very world together if he simply asked her to. She picked up her needle and resumed sewing the blue tunic. The quiet hiss of thread through wool echoed warm across the stone room. The icy wind battered the high windows of the great hall. Winter held the northern fortress in an iron grip. 3 days passed since the violent confrontation. Vincent kept his distance from the main hearth. He finally requested a formal audience on the 4th morning. Jaden sat at the long table to receive the visitor. Emily remained in her quiet corner with Leo. She was carefully stitching a dark fabric. Vincent entered the room holding a rolled parchment. He placed the official document onto the wooden table. "This treaty requires a permanent bond," Vincent announced. Jaden ignored the heavy paper. "My signature provides sufficient guarantee," Jaden replied. Vincent smiled a calculated smile. "A signature is merely ink on dead skin." He leaned forward across the wide table. My sovereign proposes a strategic marriage. Jaden stared at Vincent in silence. My sister is of noble birth, Vincent continued. He glanced quickly toward the empty corners of the hall. You possess no true heir to secure this harsh territory. Jaden felt a familiar irritation flare in his chest. Nobles consistently viewed marriage as a cheap transaction. They traded human lives for brief political advantages. He remembered the bitter isolation of his own childhood. He looked across the vast room toward the warm fire. Emily was showing Leo how to tie a complex knot. Leo laughed quietly at his own clumsy attempt. A soft smile touched Emily's tired face. Jaden turned his attention back to Vincent. I decline the offer, Jaden stated flatly. Vincent blinked in sudden shock. You reject a royal bride? Jaden stood up from his wooden chair. I require no southern spy in my bed. He picked up the rolled parchment. Take this treaty back to your sovereign. He tossed the document directly at Vincent's chest. Vincent caught the heavy roll clumsily. His face flushed with deep humiliation. You will regret this insult, Vincent hissed. Jaden stepped around the long table. Leave my fortress before I lose my remaining patience. Vincent turned swiftly and marched out of the hall. The heavy doors shut with a resounding thud. Jaden rubbed his tired eyes. Endless politics drained his energy faster than actual warfare. He walked slowly toward the roaring hearth. Leo looked up and smiled brightly. Good morning, Leo chimed. Jaden stopped and looked down at Leo. The heavy burden in his chest lightened instantly. Good morning, Jaden replied softly. Emily set her sewing tools aside. She stood up and smoothed her plain skirt. She held a folded bundle of dark fabric in her hands. I have something for you, she said. Jaden looked at the neat bundle. What is it? He asked. Emily took a deep breath to steady her racing heart. She had spent her first wages on this specific task. A traveling merchant passed through the outer gates 2 days ago. She purchased a length of fine wool. She traded her last coin for a spool of silver thread. She worked on the project by candlelight while Leo slept. You protected us, Emily began hesitantly. She looked down at the soft fabric. You gave us sanctuary when the world offered only frost. She stepped closer and held the bundle out. I wanted to repay your kindness. Jaden reached out and took the heavy fabric. The wool felt incredibly smooth against his calloused skin. He shook the bundle gently until it unfolded. It was a magnificent cloak. The dark wool was dense enough to stop a driving blizzard. A subtle pattern of silver thread lined the wide collar. The embroidery depicted a solitary wolf standing against a fierce storm. It was a masterpiece of immense dedication. Jaden stared at the exquisite garment in complete silence. He recognized the sheer cost of the raw materials immediately. You spent your wages on this, Jaden said. His voice held a thick emotion. Emily nodded slightly. A sovereign should wear garments that reflect his true strength. She kept her blue eyes fixed on his scarred face. It is not a royal gift, but it is freely given. Jaden ran his thumb over the intricate stitching. Nobody ever gave him something simply because they cared. Kings received bribes and calculated offerings. Emily offered him a piece of her own survival. She chose to enrich his life instead of securing her own future. It was the most generous act he had ever witnessed. He unclasped his old mantle. He let the worn garment fall to the stone floor. He draped the new cloak over his broad shoulders. The garment fit his large frame with absolute perfection. The heavy wool instantly trapped the heat against his body.
It is flawless, Jaden murmured. He looked at Emily with burning sincerity. Thank you. A bright blush colored Emily's pale cheeks. She felt an overwhelming sense of profound relief. I am glad it pleases you, she replied. Heavy footsteps interrupted the quiet moment. The quartermaster walked quickly into the great hall. He carried a wooden clipboard. My lord, the supply wagons are ready, the officer reported. He stopped abruptly when he noticed the new cloak. The officer bowed respectfully. Vincent is also preparing his horses. Jaden turned to face the quartermaster. Ensure he leaves before noon. The officer nodded sharply. Yes, my lord. He hesitated for a brief second. Vincent requested an inventory of the guest provisions. The officer glanced nervously toward Emily. He claims we waste precious resources on mere commoners. Jaden felt his jaw tighten in sudden anger. Vincent refused to learn his lesson. Jaden walked past the quartermaster toward the entryway. He pushed the heavy doors open. The bitter wind bit at his face. The new cloak blocked the cold with remarkable efficiency. Emily followed him slowly to the open doorway. She held Leo tightly by his small hand. They watched Jaden step out into the snowy courtyard. Vincent stood near a line of restless horses. He berated a stable boy over a tangled harness. Jaden crossed the icy cobblestones with long strides. Vincent turned around and froze. He noticed the new cloak immediately. The rich fabric commanded absolute attention. You are leaving, Jaden stated loudly. His deep voice carried easily over the howling wind. Soldiers stopped their work to watch the confrontation. Vincent straightened his velvet collar defensively. I return to a civilized court, Vincent sneered. He gestured toward the great hall. A court that does not shelter wandering beggars. Jaden did not strike Vincent. He did not need physical violence to crush the foolish pride. He turned slightly and pointed toward the open doorway. Emily stood quietly in the stone frame. She crafted this cloak, Jaden announced. His voice echoed across the crowded courtyard. She possesses more skill than your entire royal lineage. Vincent opened his mouth to argue. Jaden cut him off with a sharp motion. She is not a servant. He looked directly into Vincent's pale eyes. She is the lady of this fortress. A stunned silence fell over the snowy courtyard. The armed guards stared at Jaden in pure shock. Emily gasped quietly. She covered her mouth with her free hand. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs. Jaden turned his attention to the quartermaster. Recorded in the official ledger, Jaden commanded. Anyone who disrespects Emily or Leo answers to my blade. The quartermaster bowed deeply. It shall be done immediately, my lord. Vincent realized he had utterly lost this silent war. He mounted his horse without another word. He spurred the animal forward toward the main gates. His escort followed him in a humiliated retreat. Jaden watched them ride out into the white distance. He turned around and walked back toward the great hall. The northern soldiers immediately bowed their heads. They offered their silent respect to Emily. Jaden stopped in front of her. The cold wind whipped the edge of his new cloak. He looked down at her astonished face. You did not have to say those things, Emily whispered. Her voice trembled with raw emotion. I meant every single word, Jaden replied. He reached out and gently touched her cheek. His scarred fingers felt warm against her skin. You belong here. He looked down at Leo. Both of you. Emily leaned slightly into his gentle touch. A single tear slipped down her face. It was the profound relief of a wandering soul finding a home.
She took his large hand in hers. "We are staying," she promised. Jaden guided them back into the warmth of the hall. He closed the heavy doors against the freezing world. The roaring fire crackled cheerfully in the stone hearth. The vast room no longer echoed with a chilling emptiness. The pale winter sun finally broke through the heavy gray clouds. The snowdrifts began to melt against the dark stone walls. Water dripped steadily from the high fortress roofs. Spring was trying to breach the northern border. Emily sat near the warm hearth of the great hall. She was mending a simple linen shirt for Leo. The boy was sleeping peacefully in the adjoining room. The peaceful atmosphere shattered when a scout ran into the room. The man breathed heavily and knelt before the long wooden table. Jaden looked up from his scattered parchment maps. "Report," Jen commanded. "Raiders hold the western pass, my lord," the scout gasped. He wiped sweat from his dirt-streaked forehead. "They are the same malevolent scavengers who triggered the avalanche." Jaden gripped the edges of his wooden table. His blue eyes darkened with sudden fury. They had deliberately caused the mountain to collapse upon a civilian village. They did it merely to mask their petty theft. This was an unforgivable crime against his territory. "Sound the war horn," Jaden ordered. His deep voice echoed with the promise of swift retribution. "Saddle the Heddle cavalry." The scout bowed quickly and ran out of the hall. Emily lowered her sewing tools. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She stood up and walked toward the wooden table. Jaden was already buckling his heavy leather sword-belt. He did not call for his squires or attendants. Emily stepped close to him. "You are leaving," she stated softly. It was a simple fact, yet it carried a heavy dread. Jaden paused his movements. He looked down at her pale face. "I must secure the borders," he explained. "These men unleashed an abyss upon innocent people." He reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "I will bring them sovereign justice." Emily nodded slowly. She understood the crushing weight of his duty. She turned and walked toward the heavy wooden chest near the stairs. She opened the heavy lid and retrieved his steel chest plate. It was remarkably heavy and cold to the touch. She carried it back to him. Jaden watched her with intense surprise. Usually, terrified servants handled his armor with trembling hands. Emily held the cold steel with firm resolve. She stood on her toes to lift the plate over his head. Jaden lowered his broad shoulders to help her. The metal settled against his chest with a dull thud. Emily reached around his waist to secure the thick leather straps. Her small hands moved with practiced efficiency. She had repaired these very straps only weeks ago. She knew every buckle and iron rivet. She pulled the final strap tight and fastened the buckle. She rested her hands flat against the cold steel of his chest. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart through the metal. "Come back to us," Emily whispered. She looked up and met his gaze. "Leo needs you." She swallowed hard. "I need you." It was the first time she had voiced her own desire. Jaden felt a sharp ache in his chest. He raised his hand and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I will return before nightfall," he promised. He stepped back and picked up his heavy iron helmet. He draped the magnificent dark cloak over his armored shoulders. The silver wolf embroidered on the collar caught the pale light. He turned and strode out of the great hall. Emily stood alone by the wooden table. She listened to the loud blare of the iron war horn. The courtyard filled with the chaotic sounds of shouting men and stamping horses. Then, a heavy silence fell over the fortress as the gates closed. The hours dragged on with agonizing slowness. Emily refused to pace the stone floor. She sat down at the table and resumed her sewing. Leo woke up near midday. He rubbed his eyes and looked around the vast room. "Where is Jaden?" the boy asked. "He went to secure the mountain pass," Emily answered evenly. She offered the boy a reassuring smile. "He will be home soon." She used the word home without thinking. It felt natural and right. She spent the afternoon teaching Leo how to draw shapes on scrap parchment. She kept the young boy distracted from the ominous quiet of the garrison. Several older servants lingered near the kitchen doors. They whispered anxiously about the violent raiders. Emily stood up and walked over to them. "Return to your duties," she instructed calmly. Her voice held no anger, only steadfast authority. "The king commands the finest soldiers in the realm." She met the worried eyes of the head cook. "Prepare a hot meal for their return." The servants nodded respectfully and dispersed. Emily had assumed the mantle of leadership without hesitation. She protected the peace inside the walls while Jaden fought outside. The sun finally dipped below the high mountain peaks. Dark shadows stretched long across the stone floor of the hall. A sudden, loud cheer erupted from the outer watchtower. Emily dropped her quill. She hurried toward the heavy oak doors. She pushed them open just as the heavy cavalry rode into the courtyard. The soldiers were covered in dark mud and gray ash. They looked exhausted but victorious. The battle had been brief and decisive. Jaden rode at the front of the column. His steel armor was scratched and battered. He dismounted his massive black horse with a heavy sigh. He tossed his reins to a waiting stable boy. He looked up and saw Emily standing in the doorway. A profound relief washed over his hardened features. He walked toward her with long, purposeful strides. Emily noticed a dark stain on his left sleeve. Her breath caught in her throat. Jaden stepped into the warm hall and closed the doors. He removed his iron helmet and dropped it onto a wooden bench. He looked incredibly weary. "The pass is secure," Jaden announced softly. He did not boast of his overwhelming victory. He did not describe how his blade flashed like lightning through the enemy ranks. He only cared that the threat was permanently erased. "You are injured," Emily said. She rushed forward and reached for his left arm. A blade had sliced through the heavy leather beneath his shoulder plate. "It is a shallow scratch," Jaden dismissed. "Sit down," Emily ordered firmly. She did not wait for his permission. She pushed him gently toward his heavy wooden chair. Jaden sat down in surprising obedience. Emily hurried to fetch a clean linen cloth and warm water. She brought her wooden sewing box to the table. She carefully unbuckled his heavy chest plate. She lifted the steel away and set it on the floor. She helped him pull the ruined leather tunic over his head. His broad left shoulder bore a fresh, bleeding cut. It was not fatal, but it required immediate care. Emily washed the wound with warm water. Her touch was incredibly gentle against his bruised skin. Jaden watched her face in the flickering firelight. She was deeply focused on her task. Her brow furrowed in concentration. She threaded her fine bone needle with clean silk. "This will sting," she warned softly. "I have endured worse," Jaden replied. Emily pressed the needle through his toughened skin. Jaden did not flinch or make a sound. He merely watched her steady hands. The great hall was silent except for the crackling fire. Emily finished stitching the wound and tied a neat knot. She wrapped a clean linen bandage around his broad shoulder. She smoothed the edge of the cloth carefully. "It will heal cleanly," she assured him. She began to pack her tools back into the wooden box. Jaden reached out and caught her wrist gently. Emily froze. She looked down at his scarred hand holding hers. She slowly raised her eyes to meet his gaze. His blue eyes held an intense, unshielded emotion. "You stayed," Jaden said quietly. "I told you we belong here," Emily reminded him. Jaden stood up from his chair.
He did not release her wrist. Instead, he slid his hand down to weave his fingers through hers. He pulled her slightly closer. The imposing warlord looked down at the fragile seamstress. The vast difference in their physical strength meant nothing. She held his soul securely in her delicate hands. "I have fought for land and power my entire life," Jaden confessed. His deep voice trembled very slightly. "I conquered cities and broke enemy armies." He reached up with his free hand to cup her warm cheek. "None of it mattered, until you sat at my table." Emily felt a hot tear escape her eye. She leaned her face into his rough palm. "You gave us a future when we had no hope," she whispered. Jaden shook his head slowly. "You gave me a reason to return from the dark." He leaned down closer. "I do not want a political treaty." He searched her eyes for any hesitation. "I want you." He spoke the words as a sacred vow. "Be my wife." Emily's breath caught in her chest. She did not need to think about her answer. She did not fear the heavy burden of the Northern Crown. She only saw the man who saved a terrified orphan in the dead of night. "Yes," Emily breathed. Jaden closed his eyes in profound relief. He leaned forward and kissed her softly. It was a gentle, reverent touch. It held no violence or harsh demands. Emily kissed him back with absolute certainty. She wrapped her arms around his uninjured shoulder. She anchored him to the light. The fire roared in the stone hearth behind them. The harsh winter wind raged outside the fortress walls. Inside, the kingdom had finally found its true heart. News of the engagement spread rapidly through the stone fortress. Soldiers celebrated loudly in the lower courtyard. They drank warm ale and toasted to their triumphant king. Excitement buzzed through the usually grim military garrison. Emily sat by the familiar hearth the next morning. She did not wear fine silk or borrowed jewels. The worn fabric of her plain linen dress offered comfort on this pivotal day. Her needle moved expertly to stitch a silver wolf onto a small blue tunic. Leo sat quietly beside her on the stone floor. The child watched her quick fingers with wide eyes. "Is that for me?" Leo asked softly. Emily smiled and bit off the end of the silver thread. "It is," she answered him. She held up the finished garment to inspect the heavy seams. "You need a proper shirt for the ceremony." Leo took the new tunic with hesitant hands. He traced the embroidered wolf with his small thumb. "Does this mean we are staying forever?" A sudden warmth bloomed deep within Emily's chest. "We are staying forever," she promised firmly. Jaden walked into the great hall. He wore clean leather armor and his magnificent dark cloak. He stopped near the table and simply watched them. The deep affection passing between the woman and the boy was undeniable. They looked like a true, grounded family. He crossed the vast room and sat on the wooden bench beside Emily. The heavy wood groaned slightly under his weight. "The garrison prepared the main courtyard," Jaden announced. He reached out and ruffled Leo's dark hair. "The men wished to witness the ceremony." Emily looked at him in genuine surprise. "I thought we would exchange vows privately." Jaden shook his head gently. "You are their queen." He picked a crystal iron scissors from the wooden box. "They need to see the woman who restored their king." Emily took a deep breath to steady her racing nerves. She had spent her entire life hiding in dark corners to survive. Now, she was stepping into the brightest light possible. She stood up and smoothed her plain skirt. "I need to change my dress," she murmured. Jaden stood and offered his arm gracefully. "The house kicker placed something in your chamber." Emily walked slowly down the long stone corridor. She opened the heavy door to her small room. A magnificent gown lay across her narrow cot. It was crafted from deep blue velvet. Silver thread lined the hem and the high collar. The elegant design matched Jaden's heavy cloak perfectly. Emily traced the soft velvet with trembling fingers. She dressed quickly and brushed her long, dark hair. She walked back out into the main hall. Jaden waited patiently by the large oak doors. He lost his breath when he finally saw her. The fragile seamstress had completely vanished. She looked fierce, proud, and entirely beautiful. Leo ran forward and grabbed her hand eagerly. "You look like a real lady," the boy declared. Emily laughed softly. "Thank you, Leo." Jaden pushed open the heavy oak doors. Bright spring sunlight flooded the gloomy stone hall. The entire garrison stood in the wide courtyard. Hundreds of armored soldiers fell perfectly silent at once. They parted respectfully to form a clear path forward. Emily walked ahead with her head held remarkably high. Jaden matched her pace closely on her right side. Leo held her left hand with a secure, tight grip. They reached the raised wooden platform in the center. An old priest waited near a simple stone altar. He held a worn leather book in his wrinkled hands. Jaden turned entirely to face Emily. He took both of her hands in his scarred ones. "I vow to protect you," Jaden said loudly. His deep voice reached the farthest walls of the courtyard. "I pledge my sword and my heart to your absolute safety." Emily looked up into his intense blue eyes. "I vow to stand by you," she replied steadily. "I pledge my loyalty and my care to this home." The old priest spoke a short blessing over them both. He wrapped a heavy linen cord around their joined hands. He tied a firm knot to officially bind them together. "You are bound," the priest announced. Jaden signaled sharply to the waiting quartermaster. The officer stepped forward carrying a dark iron crown. It was utterly simple and completely devoid of rare jewels. The solid metal represented the hard, unyielding nature of the North. Jaden took the heavy crown in his large hands. He lifted it carefully over Emily's head. He placed it gently upon her dark hair. "My queen," Jaden stated with absolute conviction. The courtyard erupted into a massive, deafening cheer. Soldiers banged their swords loudly against their iron shields. The metallic rhythm echoed fiercely off the ancient mountains. Emily did not flinch at the sudden noise. She looked calmly at the cheering men. They did not mock her patched past today. They honored her present strength and pure spirit. Leo tugged excitedly on her blue velvet sleeve. Jaden bent down and lifted the boy effortlessly into his arms. Leo rested his head against Jaden's broad shoulder with a bright smile. Emily moved closer and leaned against Jaden's strong side. They stood together on the raised wooden platform. The brutal winter had finally passed from their lives. They had forged an unbreakable bond from the cold ashes of their pasts. The world outside remained dangerous and deeply uncertain. Inside these walls, however, they possessed absolute sanctuary. They walked back toward the great hall as one. The heavy oak doors remained wide open to welcome the warm spring air. The seasons shifted slowly across the northern landscape. The harsh frost of winter melted into the vibrant green of summer. The mountain pass opened to trade and travelers. Life inside the fortress underwent a subtle, permanent transformation. It was no longer merely a cold command post for military campaigns. It felt like a living, breathing home. Emily sat on the low stone bench near the main hearth. The fire crackled softly in the summer warmth. She held an open book on her lap. Leo sat cross-legged on the rug at her feet. He followed the words on the parchment with his finger. The king ruled with wisdom, Leo read aloud. He paused and looked up at Emily with a proud smile. Emily nodded encouragement. "Keep going," she said. She ran a gentle hand over his shoulder. The boy had grown taller and stronger in the last few months. The hollow look in his eyes had vanished completely. He moved with the easy confidence of a loved child. He was no longer a terrified orphan clinging to survival. He was a boy with a future. Heavy, familiar footsteps sounded on the stone floor. Jaden walked into the hall with his usual purpose. He wore a simple linen tunic without his heavy armor. He carried a small wooden box in his hands. He stopped when he saw them by the fire. The fierce warlord softened visibly at the sight. He walked over and sat down beside Emily on the bench. He placed the wooden box on the table. "The northern delegation sent these," Jaden said. He opened the lid to reveal polished river stones and wildflowers. Leo stood up quickly to inspect the offering. "They look like treasures," Leo whispered. "They are gifts of peace," Jaden replied.
He looked at his wife and his son. The simple reality of his life still surprised him occasionally. He had spent decades anticipating betrayal and violent death. Now, he anticipated quiet evenings and shared meals. He reached out and took Emily's hand, his scarred fingers interlaced with her soft ones. The heavy iron crown she wore during ceremonies was gone. She wore only a simple silk ribbon in her dark hair. She was the same woman who had mended his cloak in the dark. The wealth and titles changed nothing about their core connection. She was the heart of the fortress. She provided the compassion that held his fractured world together. "The repairs on the outer wall are finished," Jaden noted. "The garrison reports no threats on the horizon." Emily leaned her head against his shoulder. "We have time," she whispered. "We have enough time for everything." Jaden closed his eyes and inhaled the scent of pine and soap. He remembered the cold, agonizing ache of his own burning childhood. He remembered the bitter winter night he met the seamstress. He thought about the charred cloak he still kept in his private study. It no longer represented a life lost to the ashes. It represented the resilience that brought them together. Leo sat back down and resumed reading his book. His voice was steady and filled with youthful optimism. The sounds of the garrison outside were muted and distant. The fortress was secure. The people were fed and protected. The fear that once dominated the region had dissolved into stability. Jaden watched the firelight dance in the stone hearth. It was the same hearth where he had first seen Emily kneeling. It was the same hearth where he had first felt mercy. He looked down at his wife. She was watching Leo with an expression of quiet pride. She did not seek power or status. She only sought to heal the broken parts of the world. She had healed him entirely. "I remember the cold," Jaden murmured. Emily opened her eyes and looked at him. "I remember," she agreed. She squeezed his hand tighter. "But the fire is much stronger than the ice." Jaden nodded. He stood up and offered his hand to her. She took it and rose to her feet beside him. They walked toward the heavy oak doors together. The summer sunset painted the northern sky in deep gold. The vast, jagged mountains looked beautiful in the soft light. Leo followed them closely, holding a toy sword made of wood. They stepped out into the courtyard. Soldiers saluted them with genuine respect. There was no cowering in their posture today. There was only loyalty to the family that kept them safe. Emily breathed in the clear, fresh air. She had come here as a starving stranger. She had arrived with nothing but a needle and thread. She had left with everything that truly mattered. She possessed a home, a husband, and a son. She possessed the strength to face any coming winter. Jaden looked at his kingdom. It was vast and rugged, but it was at peace. He realized that his greatest victory was not a battle won. His greatest victory was the life he built in the silence. He looked at Emily and smiled. The warlord had finally found his true purpose. He was the protector of the hearth. He was the guardian of the home. They stood together as the stars began to appear. The fortress stood firm against the turning of the world. Inside the walls, the light of the fire remained constant. It was a beacon for those lost in the dark. It was a testament to the power of love. The story of the king and the seamstress would be told for generations. It would be told as a reminder of a simple truth. The coldest hearts could be thawed by kindness. The deepest wounds could be mended by care. The broken could be made whole again. They turned back toward the warmth of the hall. The heavy doors closed softly behind them. The fire continued to burn. Their life together was just beginning. And in that warmth, they were truly, finally home.
You know, this story really stayed with me. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound healing doesn't come from a grand gesture, but from the quiet, steady courage to simply stay when everyone else would have walked away. If Jaden and Emily's journey warmed your heart, please subscribe to join our little family. I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from today. Drop your city in the comments below. And tell me, when was the last time a small, unexpected act of kindness changed your whole day? I'll be reading every single one. Thanks for listening.